Good morning, everyone. This is slightly odd. Normally I have to yell at you to sit down, and everyone's sitting down ahead of schedule. So clearly there's a high degree of anticipation for the talk today. So welcome. Let me begin by paying my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're gathered today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today's breakfast seminar is being held just a week after the Premier's Prizes for Science and Engineering, which culminated, I'm sure you're all aware, in Professor Helen Christensen from UNSW Sydney being awarded the Premier's Prize. She will, of course, give their first talk next year, so please remember that when we get to that point. Today's seminar, though, looks at a condition that has touched many Australian families, including my own. Dementia is a leading cause of morbidity and disability for older Australians, and there are nearly 500,000 people living with dementia today. With an increasingly ageing population, Australia is set to quadruple the rates of dementia by 2050. Additionally, there will be many older people living with various forms of cognitive decline. And our speaker today, Professor Sarah Naismith, is at the forefront of this research. Sharon is a clinical neurophysiologist, NHMRC Dementia Leadership Fellow, and holds the Leonard P. Ullman Chair in Psychology at the Charles Perkins Centre at the University of Sydney. She also heads the Healthy Brain Ageing Program at the Brain and Mind Centre, a one-of-its-kind early intervention research clinic for dementia. Sharon is also a member of the Australian Physiological Society and is practicing clinical neurophysiologist. I think I might have got that wrong, neuropsychologist. I'm sorry. I too am getting old. Today, Sharon will look at the mechanisms by which modifiable risk factors for dementia, including depression, sleep disturbance and cardiovascular disease, impact the brain and how best to treat them. She will also consider the current landscape of Australian health services for dementia detection and management to highlight key directions for improvement. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sharon Naismith to present Optimising Brain Health for Dementia Prevention, Current Landscape and Future Pathways.
Thanks so much, Hugh. I'm really excited to see such a full audience here this morning, and always really excited to talk about brain ageing and healthy brain ageing. I'm quite passionate about some of the things that we need to do in this space to really make a difference. But I know it's very early, but can we start with a show of hands of who here has been touched by dementia in someone that they know or a family member? So it affects pretty much all of us at some point. And more recently, it's affected me as well. So my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease, and my mum now has a really aggressive neurodegenerative condition. So it's becoming even more apparent how ill-equipped we are in society to deal with dementia. So I'm actually going to touch on a range of different factors today to, first of all, give you an understanding of dementia. What is it? How do we diagnose it? To really highlight that it is a problem of ageing, and we are an ageing population. For those of you that reside in New South Wales, which I think is probably most of you, what does dementia look like in New South Wales? Why is it important that we start thinking more about dementia? How can we prevent it? And there's some really new wonderful innovations in the field. So I want to tell you about those because I think that's where we can really make a difference. Are we prepared as a society, and are we prepared in New South Wales and Australia? And what else you can do if you have or know someone that might be experiencing cognitive decline that leads to dementia. So I'll just start with this umbrella term of dementia then. So it is an umbrella term. There are many different diseases that sit under the umbrella of dementia. The most common form of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. Many of you might have heard about that, and that affects about 60 to 70% of people with later onset dementia. So we do have early onset dementia, which in many respects is determined by changes in our genes or certain genes. But I'm today talking about the late onset forms of dementia, so predominantly affecting people in later life. Alzheimer's disease is the most common, followed by vascular dementia. Now, as you might expect, vascular dementia is related to changes in the blood vessels of our brain, so the same kinds of changes that lead to stroke, but you can get much more subtle changes in the very small vessels that are in the middle of the brain as well. And so these changes creep up over a number of years, leading to different forms of cognitive decline. And in reality, Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia co-occur together. So they're often mixed. In about 80% of cases, it's very rare to just have very pure Alzheimer's disease. If you have Alzheimer's pathology in your brain and you also have vascular risks, so things like high blood pressure or cholesterol, and maybe a smoker, then it's more likely that you'll decline a lot faster as well. We then have frontotemporal dementia. This affects younger people, so it's not a common form of late onset dementia, but might affect people in their 50s or 60s, and you get very prominent changes in personality and behaviour, or you can get other variants that affect speech. We then have Lewy body dementia, and this is caused by changes in the proteins, the alpha-synuclein protein in the brain, and this is also related to Parkinson's disease. Lewy body dementia is very different in its presentation, so we get visual hallucinations, we get falls, and also marked fluctuations in cognition and a very rapid decline. So within a few years, someone will decline fairly substantially with Lewy body dementia. And then we get other forms of dementia that might be caused by things like multiple sclerosis or Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease as well. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common, and that's the one that we'll be talking about today predominantly, and also in combination with the vascular dementia types. So many of you, if you've been touched by dementia, might know what some of the early signs are. In reality, these things can go kind of unchecked for a number of years because people do put them down to normal ageing. But dementia often starts with changes in memory, difficulty navigating, having problems with word finding, misplacing things, having confusion about time or place, or difficulty with speech or comprehension. There can be a whole host of things, and so there's no one kind of pattern. But when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, we often get a typical pattern because the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, which is due to amyloid plaque, so changes in the proteins in the brain, it predominantly affects the hippocampus, so the memory structure in our brain that is very, very sensitive. Embryologically, it kind of develops very early, and it's the seat of our memory. And so that's why these very subtle changes in memory often occur first, and then the disease will kind of spread into different areas, the temporal lobes of the brain, and then we might get changes in language as well. And then eventually it will spread to the parietal lobes, which is where we start to navigate or use maps or use remote controls or other kind of, technical things. And eventually it will go to the frontal lobes of the brain. So in Alzheimer's disease, you'll find that someone is often very intact socially. They can have a great conversation with you. You can have a good laugh. Their appreciation of sarcasm and humour and all of those things is generally very, very good. But it's those earlier changes in the brain that are kind of manifesting first. And so how do we detect this? So often someone will report to a doctor, a GP, for example, that they're noticing some of these changes. And we'll talk about later, but unfortunately a lot of initial presentations to GPs go kind of unchecked or put down to normal ageing. And there's a number of reasons for that, but in reality GPs don't have great tools for that, and also people that are highly educated or have high occupational attainment, these tools are pretty much useless in those very, very early stages. So people will go undiagnosed. If it does get picked up that maybe this is something we should consider seriously, then they might get referred to a specialist, so a geriatrician, neurologist, or psychiatrist. And then again, in people of higher educational or occupational complexity, we would do very detailed neuropsychological testing. So that's what I do as a neuropsychologist. I'm very mean. I spend hours with someone with a clipboard and ask all questions about their memory and give different problem-solving tests and things like that. And then we can build up a pattern of what does the cognitive impairment look like. So it's kind of like taking a snapshot or a picture of the brain. We then do brain scans. We look at the structure of the hippocampus, which we can see very well on an MRI scan, and we can do other functional scans. Internationally, people do lumbar punctures. So they get a sample of the cerebrospinal fluid, which is very invasive, and then can actually determine biologically if the disease or the cognitive impairment is definitively caused by Alzheimer's disease. And we can also do PET scans, and they're quite expensive. So in Sydney, we have probably only North Shore Hospital, which can do it very rarely. We will send someone there to get confirmation on a PET scan that someone has amyloid, because people in Australia really don't like having lumbar punctures, which is understandable. I'm not advocating for that. But PET scans are largely inaccessible and certainly more available in Victoria than they are in Sydney. And the definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and the type of dementia that someone's living with would be done at post-mortem. And so the reality is, though, people don't usually present to people like me in the very, very late stages. There's a very long preclinical period where often someone will say, I've noticed some changes, in my memory or thinking, or I'm not quite functioning at the level I used to. And certainly, even in people of high education and occupational complexity, they might say it's just more difficulty organising myself or planning things or problem solving. And these kinds of changes are sometimes really hard to detect on testing, but we call that a kind of preclinical phase. If someone comes along and has some formal testing and we find evidence that there is changes in cognition, but someone is still functional, so they're still doing, their usual daily activities, still working well, still able to kind of function in society, we would say that someone has mild cognitive impairment. And it's really important that we start to detect people more in this mild cognitive impairment stage, because if we detect someone in this stage, 45% of those people will progress to dementia within 5 years. So it's a very high risk stage. And if you think about other medical conditions like breast cancer, etc., we don't wait until it's too late anymore. We stage cancer according to the level that it is and the opportunity for intervention. And we know now that in this mild cognitive impairment stage, it's a key phase for opportunity for intervention, secondary interventions, and we can talk about some of those. And indeed, the field is moving even earlier now to this preclinical phase and thinking about interventions that we can offer at that stage. In reality, this is very hard at a population level because it would mean doing interventions on everybody just to kind of reduce risk in this preclinical phase. But now that we're getting more better with the kind of biology of disease, we can start to think about population-level interventions. And dementia will become more common because our population is ageing. Many of you will know this. You can see from the graph on the left the changes in the ageing population, but you can also see from the age distribution from 2019 to 2026, the graph on the right, that there'll be a much larger proportion of older people. So the proportion of older Australians will double, and those aged over 85, so the elderly, will triple. And this has huge implications also for the workforce, which is an area that I'm particularly interested in at the moment, because we'll have major changes in the composition of older people in the workforce. We need to get rid of age discrimination in the workforce, and we need to support people to be able to function better in the workforce. We do it for many other diseases, many other neurological diseases, but unfortunately people that are experiencing cognitive decline tend to leave the workforce, and that's going to be, even compound the problems of ageing even further. So in our clinic at the University of Sydney, we have people coming along who notice very subtle changes in their cognition, and we've been doing a survey, and our data shows that of people that left the workforce in the last 5 years, 50% of them were experiencing cognitive decline. And they're very young. They're in their late 50s and early 60s, these people. And so there was no support in the workplace. There's no way to kind of change the functioning of the workplace to support that person. And as a neuropsychologist in my training, we did that a lot for other diseases, head injury, multiple sclerosis, different diseases like that, but we're really behind the ball in terms of ageing. We said dementia will become more common. Obviously, we have declining birth rates and we have increasing life expectancy. So because dementia is a disease of ageing, we will have more people. And you can see here the graph that shows essentially the increase in dementia prevalence as people get older. So we have around 400,000 people now with dementia, and by 2050 there will be 1 million people. But in addition, we know that there's at least another 1 million people that have this mild cognitive impairment, this early phase. And it's hard to get really good estimates of how many people have mild cognitive impairment. The data suggests that maybe between 11 and 17% of older people living in the community will have mild cognitive impairment. But if you talk about people that come along to clinics presenting and concerned about their cognition, it may be closer to only around 4% of people. So we really don't have wonderful estimates of that, but at least 1 million people have that. As I said, dementia increases with age. Roughly, we kind of use a rule of thumb that at age 60, around 5% of people have dementia, and it doubles every 5 years after that. So by the age of 85, around 25% of people will have at least dementia pathology in their brain, increasing to 42% aged over 90. And importantly, people with dementia are living in the community, and we want people with dementia to be living in the community. We want to keep older people in the community for longer than what we have done by having adequate support systems for cognition, not just for physical health, which is where the focus tends to be at the moment. How do we keep people healthy? Can we give people physio, etc.? But we really don't have much in terms of cognitive supports or expertise for supporting cognition within the home. In terms of bringing it home, we actually have, some pockets already of older or ageing populations in Sydney and New South Wales. So you can actually see this heat map online of the over 65s, where we have pockets in Hunters Hill, and also the Ku-ring-gai area where we have a kind of older population. And importantly, you can actually take that further and look at the electorates in New South Wales where we have already high rates of dementia. So these are in regional areas, predominantly Mile Lakes, Port Macquarie, the Tweed area, Bega, etc. The services there are absolutely dismal. People can wait, 9 months to a year just to get an initial assessment for dementia. But you can see, importantly, that there are going to be some changes in the distribution and prevalence of dementia, even in a lot of areas in Sydney. So Wahroonga, which I would regard as a fairly affluent area, but has an ageing population, there'll be big increases there. Stratfield, Summerhill, Wakehurst, Kogarah, these are all areas, within Sydney. So we are going to be seeing more people with dementia and more people in the community in New South Wales. And we are at New South Wales Parliament, so it is important to talk about money. Dementia costs money. So $8.1 billion it costs in 2024. This is a report that we were recently part of for Evo Health. And they calculated that this would actually increase to $17 billion by 2050. So we have big increases in the cost of dementia, as you might expect, and $3.7 billion was directly spent in the health and aged care system on dementia, including hospitalisation, home care packages, etc. And then, of course, there's additional costs that are not even factored in here, and these additional costs relate to the impact on carers, how much time it takes out from carers, and often these might be women that already have, children that they're raising. Obviously, this is a stereotype, but there are additional pressures on women in the caring roles, and also their lost wages and productivity from the caring roles that they have. More important than money, we often talk about many healthcare conditions in terms of money, and I'm very ashamed to say that often when we're talking to government, we do talk about money. If you do this, it will save you this much. But importantly, dementia affects people. So the large majority of people that have received a diagnosis of dementia say that they've lost close contact with their friends, that they feel patronised and they're not smart anymore when they have interactions with people. They feel that their life is over. And 22% of people say that they fear that they'll lose their significant other because of experiencing dementia and the pressures. And those of you that have experienced it know these pressures that are put upon family members with dementia. So carers also then feel that, they're worried or they're depressed or anxious in their role, that, the future is uncertain. They often feel angry or resentful. Why is this happening to us? This was supposed to be a time of retirement where we can all enjoy it. And 3 in 4 carers have one or more physical and emotional impacts due to their caring responsibilities. Also, people in the community care about dementia. So of the health conditions that people rated as being of greatest concern, 29%, dementia was rated by 29% as being like the biggest health condition. So we should listen to that. People want us to do more about brain health and more about dementia. So what can we do about dementia, and when should we do it? It's the next question. So this was the latest calculation from the Lancet Commission. So it came out in 2024, launched at the conference in Philadelphia in July, and essentially they look at the population attributable risk of different things that contribute to dementia. I haven't included here one of the genetic risks for dementia, which is ApoE4. So there's the apolipoprotein E genotype, which is a risk factor for dementia. So about 25% of the population have one of these alleles. You might have seen Chris Hemsworth, in the news, worried that he had one of these alleles. And if you have one of these ApoE alleles, it doubles or triples your risk of getting dementia compared to the normal population. If you have two, so one from each parent, then your risk of Alzheimer's disease actually increases even more, about 8 to 12-fold. So this is a fixed risk that we can't do anything about, and then we have the increasing ageing, which we also can't do anything about. But all of these things we can do something about. So education is the biggest risk. That's obviously something we can think about early in life, so accounting for about 5% of dementia risk. And it seems to be the quality of the education is particularly important. So in countries where the quality of education has been increased, the dementia prevalence has actually decreased. And so it seems to be a reading age of 14 or 15 years is kind of a key level to attain. So we need to think about better education from a global perspective. Then there's also traumatic brain injury. You could argue you can't do anything about that once you've got it, but there are things that we can do to prevent traumatic brain injury. The other ones I've put in a kind of category, these are all cardiovascular risks. So smoking, high LDL cholesterol, hypertension. So, hypertension over 130 in particular is problematic, but, data suggests maybe we should be keeping that under 120. Diabetes, obesity as well are really key. Physical activity accounts for about 2%, hearing and visual loss 9%, so vision, changes in vision are the new thing that came out in this commission that weren't there before. Air pollution, depression, social isolation and alcohol. So I'll talk about some of these, not all of them just for lack of time today, but importantly these account for 45% of dementia risk. Most people don't know this. Most people think dementia is inevitable and there's nothing that we can do about it. So what about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders? Well, we need to be even more vigilant with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. They tend to get dementia earlier. So we really need to be thinking about dementia from about age 40 in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And we actually have the highest rates globally in terms of the prevalence rates for dementia in Aboriginal Australians. There's been some wonderful work by my colleague Kylie Radford, who's one of our interns at the Brain and Mind Centre actually, but she's gone on to do wonderful things with the Corey Growing Well Old study and actually followed up some Aboriginal communities and showed in particular that after considering things like age, that male sex, having an unskilled work history, having vision and hearing problems, polypharmacy use, and also this ApoE genotype were linked to increasing dementia in this community. And so when should we be thinking about dementia then if we know that these risks are evident? Well, you saw from the other graph that midlife seems to be an important time to target many of these risks. And indeed, Australian data has really kind of been seminal in shifting our thinking about when we should be thinking about dementia. And that really needs to be from midlife. So from the age of 40, we need to be thinking about it because you see all these changes are occurring in the brain in this preclinical period. So this amyloid, this pathological protein builds up in the brain over a period of about 10 to 20 years, and then someone will come to a clinic like ours and they'll have mild cognitive impairment or be classified as having mild cognitive impairment, and then after that there's not that much that we can really do. Once the progression of the disease has gone too far, then the opportunity for intervention is much less. And when we start to get the changes in cognition, in memory and word finding and those things, we also get this other protein in the brain, this tau protein, hyperphosphorylation of tau, and that in particular is really bad. Once we've got tau in the brain, it's a very, very complex protein. We don't really know how to treat it and have little understanding of it. So we really want to get in before we get that tau protein in the brain and before the cognitive impairment has progressed too much. So some things that we can do that are really helpful are exercise and cognitive interventions in particular have a good, strong evidence base around them now. So the data on exercise suggests that midlife fitness is actually really important for increasing our brain volume 20 years later. That it is also associated with improved memory and cognitive functions. In particular, aerobic training, but also strength training or resistance training is important. 45 minutes of moderate vigorous exercise is most beneficial, and what you might have heard of, the HIIT training, the high intensity training, is really beneficial. But overall, 120 to 150 minutes of exercise a week following the American Academy of Sports Medicine is what we should be thinking of. And we know that we're not achieving these levels in Australia, in older Australians. There was a study in the US that followed people that were aged over 65 and showed that those that exercised more than 3 times a week had a 32% reduction in dementia. And there was also a cohort study of 1,400 people that recorded physical exercise 5 times between the ages of 36 and 49 and showed that being active at all ages was associated with a lower risk of dementia compared to having no physical activity. And you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through all these studies, but this is what we call a meta-analysis. So this is bringing together all of the synthesis of evidence across all of the different studies that we conduct. And you'll see there's been a lot of studies that have been conducted in exercise. They're all of variable quality, but importantly, we know that if you pull all of these studies together, that exercise is associated with a decreased risk of dementia. So about a 20% decreased risk in short and long-term follow-up over periods of up to 20 years. And not only Alzheimer's disease, but also vascular dementia, as you might expect. And we would expect that because exercise plays a really important role in supporting the vascular integrity of the brain. Animal studies have also shown that you actually can increase neurotrophins. So neurotrophins, we have lots of these in the brain, particularly when they're small, and they help neurons to grow and survive and mature in the brain. Of course, if we're exercising, we increase the brain circulation. The brain cells actually can survive and have less insults. Exercise actually increases the amount of amyloid, this toxic protein in the brain that we really don't want to accumulate. It lowers our other cardiovascular risk, so it's a good thing to do for our cardiovascular health. And we talk about oxidative stress a lot these days and inflammation in the brain, and this is the thing that we're really now starting to unpack in terms of the critical role that inflammation and the changes in the immune and inflammatory systems can have. And animal studies, again, support that exercise has a key role there. And of course, it helps our mood and stress relief, also helps our sleep, and also slows functional decline in dementia. So the current treatments for dementia are called cholinesterase inhibitors, and if you give someone with cognitive decline, a cholinesterase inhibitor versus exercise is much better at slowing the functional decline that you'll see in dementia than what those drugs are. Something I've been very passionate about in my early training in the field of mental health, and so pleased to hear Helen Christensen receive the Premier's Prize. She's done such wonderful work in the field of depression along with my colleague Ian Hickey, and I'd started my career in this field. Really looking at depression in older people. And depression, when it occurs for the first time in later life, so we say after age 50, is often due to some of these vascular changes in the brain that disrupt our mood circuit. So we get changes in the white matter of the brain, the key parts that connect the neurons and the grey matter. And it's actually also hard to treat. So we can get, low mood, loss of interest in things that we usually enjoy, often mixed anxiety, somatic symptoms or gastrointestinal symptoms, fatigue and poor sleep, a whole constellation of symptoms in depression, but it does become common and often presents a little bit differently in later life. And when it does, it's hard to treat. And importantly, the studies we've done in the past have shown that depression, if untreated, actually results in a smaller hippocampus, that key part of the brain that looks after our memory. When you look at a meta-analysis, so again, a synthesis of some of the studies that have examined depression over longer periods of time, there's a consistent risk of increased risk of dementia with depression. So double the risk of dementia in someone that has depression. A couple of studies in particular that I wanted to highlight was the Swedish registry that looked at 41,000 dementia-free twins and showed an increased risk for dementia if depression was at midlife, late life, life, mid to late life, or even if someone had lifelong depression. So it doesn't matter when you get it, it's still a risk. And having more education seemed to attenuate that risk a little bit, but the genetic and early life factors didn't play a huge role. Again, similar findings in the Danish case control study where they showed a really high risk for dementia, so 2.41 in 250,000 people that were diagnosed at age 50. So this is really profound, important to look out for in our older people and important to get treated. So the antidepressant medications do actually help to correct some of those imbalances in the neurotrophins in the brain, and data shows that they actually probably do slow this hippocampal compromise. We don't have really good trials on whether someone should take an antidepressant or not and the longer term effects of that. But there is data from the UK Biobank that has followed people for many, many years and showed that non-drug and drug treatments are both helpful in actually then reducing that risk if someone has the onset of depression later in life. I included alcohol because everybody wants to know about alcohol. I always get asked about alcohol in these talks. And we've talked about really this J-shaped relationship between alcohol and dementia for a very, very long time. My sense is we don't really fully understand this, and this was indeed the conclusion by the Lancet Commission as well. It seems to be that not drinking alcohol is associated with an increased risk of dementia. But we actually think that... I know, that's what everyone wants to hear, which I thought is why I would show you. So I certainly use that myself to justify having a glass of wine or two in the evening. But there are some methodological problems in these studies, and that we think that people are just asking people at that point in time how much alcohol you haven't really done a full alcohol history. And so maybe there is, less risk associated with not drinking. We do know that excessive alcohol, there's a strong risk of development of dementia. And if people change their drinking patterns from excessive drinking to light drinking, that it does seem to decrease the risk of dementia. So that's good news too for anyone that thinks, oh, I've pickled my brain, what am I going to do? We can still actually decrease our risk of dementia, even if we've had kind of heavy drinking periods. And so, essentially this has been repeated and shown, much more detailed studies, including this one from South Korea that followed people over 3 years, really, with a close tracking of their dementia risk, and showed that mild or moderate or mild alcohol consumption were associated with a lower risk of dementia. So the good news is we can keep drinking for now, because unlike some diseases like cancer, for the brain, there's not really definitive evidence that any alcohol is bad. But I believe for other conditions, and indeed, in Canada, it's suggested now we don't have any alcohol, or two drinks a week is kind of our limit. But we don't yet know that for brain health. So ignorance is bliss, I say. I'll keep having my couple of drinks every now and then. Air pollution, this is certainly not an area of expertise of mine, but I think it's really interesting and something we need to be thinking about. So they're very difficult studies to do, as you might expect. You often need, very, very large population numbers to look at air pollution and the risk on dementia. But some studies that have looked at population have shown that the particulate matter of 2.5 is associated with about a 10% increased risk of dementia, and also nitrogen dioxide risks as well. So there's a lot of different studies in different cities. My colleagues are here from Shanghai, and I know that the data is less clear from China in terms of really understanding the pollution kind of risk. And in those countries, you might think that we're really well positioned to examine these. If the data is unclear, we need to do more research. We always need to do more research. But certainly a systematic review of the studies that exist today does show that chronic exposure to air pollution is associated with an increased risk of dementia. One way of kind of really examining this is to use animal models, and some of the animal models that have looked at air pollution show that there is an association between particulate matter and changes in the hippocampus, so that key structure of the brain that supports our memory. And there's a little picture that you'll see on here, and that's the subfields of the hippocampus. So we can break this structure, even though it's very small, up into tiny little parts, and there are a couple of parts in particular that's called the CA1 and the CA3 region. And the animal studies show that those regions in particular are linked to air pollution. and also to changes in episodic memory over time. And that animal data is supported by data from the US showing strong links between changes in memory and changes in pollution levels as well. And aside from the kind of risk of air pollution, we know that in older people that already have dementia, that air pollution is associated with increased hospitalisation, and an exacerbation of their various behavioural and or cognitive difficulties as well. And the one that's not included yet on the Lancet Commission is climate change. At the University of Sydney, we're having a lot of discussions about climate change and planetary health, and indeed starting to think about some studies we will do in this space. We have a really cool heat chamber. So anyone wants to sign up to sleep in 35 degrees without a fan and come and speak to me. They are approved by ethics, these studies. But, you know, there's lots of things that we really need to be thinking about because the data shows that for heat stress, for women and older women in particular, it seems to be the most pronounced. And what can we do as a society to think about scalable solutions for climate change so that we can actually be more comfortable in our homes and also keep people living in the community without thinking about this. So just want to move on now to what we call cognitive training. So this is an area that's been, linked with some controversy because you might remember there were lots of these little apps that people were doing to kind of improve their brain health. Well, of course, we've already seen that education is something that's linked to better brain health later in life. And so there's something in that. There's something in using our brains that's important. And it may be education, but it may also be occupational complexity and keeping our brains stimulated by different things. So we don't always want to do the same thing with our brain. We want to take it into a new environment when we can do different things. Again, this is a meta-analysis. This one's a little bit more simple, and what they've done is looked at the different combinations of having low education and high occupational complexity. And as you can see pretty clearly here, the group at the bottom that have high education, high occupational complexity have the greatest reduced risk for dementia. And then of those that have the low education and then the low occupational complexity that should have been the other way around. Have a reduced risk, you're all okay. Reduced risk of dementia if you have occupational complexity and a high education versus those that have a lower level. And this is because education and occupational complexity actually contribute to a concept we call cognitive reserve. And this has shown that we actually can withstand more of this dementia pathology in our brain without showing any symptoms if we have more education and occupational complexity. Once you actually get the disease and it really sets in, then it may end up being the same. But certainly what we want to be able to do is push back any dementia pathology in our brain for as long as possible before it shows up. And cognitive reserve is the key to doing that. So it makes our brains more resilient. And the way that it does that is, you might have heard of this concept called neuroplasticity, the brain that changes itself, by Norman Doidge, wrote a book many years ago. And it essentially increases the density of the synaptic density and dendritic growth from the neurons. So if you think of it like a tree in the autumn versus the beautiful trees we see outside today, then actually cognitive interventions play a key role in increasing this dendritic density, which in turn allows our brain to communicate with itself much better and have much richer connections. So what happens if you start doing these kind of cognitive exercises in later life? Does that work? And the answer is it actually does. So there's been some fantastic community studies in the US that have looked at this. We've done our own studies at the Brain and Mind Centre in people that have late life depression and mild cognitive impairment, really looking at increasing the amount of cognitive activity that we're giving to people. And our data showed that we actually could improve people's memory, we could improve mood, and we could also improve sleep. And indeed, we're now taking these programs out into the broader community, and Dementia Australia are rolling out a program called MCI Thinking Ahead. And we've worked with them quite closely on how to translate this into something scalable for use within the community. We're also teaching people in memory clinics throughout Australia how to deliver these kinds of interventions, because what happens at the moment, someone will go to a memory clinic and they're told you have dementia, go away and get your finances in order, and I might see you again in a year or two, and that's pretty much it, unfortunately. So we really need to be doing more in terms of interventions. We've also adapted this program for Parkinson's disease and also in other aspects of psychiatric illnesses and conditions as well, like COPD, the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Some studies do show that there are effects on the brain as well, but we haven't had a great number of brain imaging studies, and importantly, there's no harmful effects. And it seems you need to be doing it at least two or three times a week for about 30 minutes. And the key is to do things that are different for the brain. And ideally, it would be with people who are skilled in delivering these programs, but there has been a lot of advances also in other programs that can be used online to facilitate that as well. And I guess the kind of challenge now is to think about how do we take these kind of interventions out to people. So at the University of Sydney, we were really lucky to receive some philanthropic funding to partner with the Conservatorium of Music. So we're now running a music intervention for up to 450 people that will have memory changes. And we're really keen to see, because there used to be some messaging around go and learn a musical instrument and you'll kind of keep your brain healthy. We're really keen to see that, does learning a new musical instrument or playing in a choir actually help your memory and actually slow the disease. And if that works, that's something that's scalable and we can actually deliver more broadly in the community than people needing to come into specialised clinics. I might preface this by saying sleep was not considered to be a risk factor in the latest Lancet Commission report on dementia. But sleep is really important for mood, alertness, for our cardiovascular health, including also neurogenesis, so that growth of new brain cells, for increasing the density of our synaptic connections. We lay down memories overnight while we're sleeping, and we also flush the brain of toxins. So we have one of these NHMRC Synergy grants, one of the big program grants, to try to unpack the role of sleep in a little bit more detail. And we think that it's been a particularly problematic area because there are so many different types of sleep disturbances we need to consider. So we need to consider obstructive sleep apnea, which seems to be associated with a 26% increased risk of dementia due to the fact that we're fragmenting sleep when we have sleep apnea, and also the brain is starved of oxygen. So these are really detrimental, and certainly we've shown that even in people coming along to our memory clinic who have concerns about their cognition, they have moderate sleep apnea, and when we treat it, we can improve their memory. So it's a really important thing to watch out for in midlife. Snoring and being overweight is one of the big risks, but it's something we can do something about with gold standard treatments, and that would be the CPAP treatment. Sleep duration, short sleep duration from midlife seems to be really important as well. So studies have shown that if someone sleeps, 5 or 6 hours a night, then their risk of dementia 25 years later is increased. Insomnia is associated with a lesser risk, but still is associated with increased risk of dementia, as well as changes in the timing of our sleep. So advanced circadian rhythms seem to be important. And this last one, REM sleep behaviour disorder, is not well linked to Alzheimer's disease, but it has a really strong link to different types of dementia, including dementia with Lewy bodies and Parkinson's. So this is when someone acts out their dreams when they sleep. They're usually quite violent enactments, and it's because usually when we're in our dreaming sleep, we have muscle atonia, but we lose this ability in REM sleep behaviour disorder. And so that's one we need to watch out for. Unfortunately, we don't have any good treatments for it at the moment, and don't show that if we screen people for it, we can reduce the risk of dementia with Lewy bodies, but it is something researchers are working on in the world, including and targeting things like neuroinflammation. So what's new? This is what you all want to know. What's new and what hope is on the horizon? Well, the really cool thing is that we can now detect dementia in the blood. So you can come along to our clinic. We do a blood test. We look at the plasma. And there are some worldwide studies that have shown that these plasma biomarkers are as good as doing the lumbar punctures, which none of us want to do, and also as good as doing the PET scans. So the PET scans at the moment are the gold standard really in the clinical diagnosis in Australia, but we now can detect these proteins in the blood. So we are already looking at how do we actually take these out into practice, and we're working with the Department of Health on a couple of trials. We're running at the Brain and Mind Centre one where we're looking at does knowing this blood marker improve a clinician's diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. That's the information we need to take to Medicare so that we can ask for rebates. Sadly, we're already thinking about this stuff, but does it actually improve clinician management? There have been international studies that have shown that the concordance in primary and secondary care is over 90% between the GP and a specialist diagnosis if GPs are using these biomarkers. And in contrast, if they only do a clinical assessment, then the accuracy decreases. Even in specialist clinics, it decreases, and that's just because it's sometimes hard to disentangle the clinical effects of the disease. The other really cool thing is that we do actually have new drugs available now. So these are all based on the amyloid hypothesis. So we talked about amyloid accumulating in the brain for 20 years or so. And there are some drugs that decrease the production of amyloid, beta amyloid, and some that increase its clearance. So the ones that increase its clearance are the ones that are the most promising. And again, I could show you another one of those slides with loads and loads of studies on, but some of those drugs have failed. But 3 drugs in particular of that particular class have proven to be useful in slowing the clinical symptoms of disease. And these are aducanumab, which you might have heard about in the press because it was used in the US, and the data is kind of less clear on aducanumab. But lecanemab and donanemab were really, really good trials. So published in the New England Journal of Medicine and also in JAMA. Which of course are very prestigious journals. Both of them were robust clinical trials, so 1,700 to 1,800 people in both across the world. And lecanemab is the one that's kind of first cab off the rank. I remember being at a meeting in San Francisco a couple of years ago and everyone was like super excited. There were big parties going on when these results came out. And that's because it slows the cognitive decline by 27%. It also slows the quality of life decline that you see in Alzheimer's disease by 35%. But there are some side effects. There has been some bleeding on the brain, and these seem to be in people that have that genetic disposition, the ApoE4. And so there's some kind of uncertainty between clinicians at the moment as to whether this is a useful thing. It costs about $30,000 plus all the medical tests that are associated with it. You'll see from the graph there the separation after 18 months of the lecanemab group and the placebo group. So again, looks really strong. It wasn't approved by the TGA just the week before last. The TGA declined to approve lecanemab. It has been approved in many other countries, so in the US, in Israel, South Korea, Japan, China. Our colleagues in China are here and already using it. Hundreds of people, but we really have to be vigilant about monitoring people for bleeding on the brain and not including people with that ApoE4 allele. I think that the best way to summarise these at the moment is that we're very, very early stages of understanding these drugs. We do need more data, and we need more real-world data beyond what the pharmaceutical companies have published, and we really need to know that they have a big impact on cognition that is meaningful for people, for the cost that they are associated with, and how much can they actually really delay the disease by. And our estimates are probably about 6 months or so. A new way to think about Alzheimer's disease, this is coming. No longer will we be thinking about Alzheimer's disease as being a clinical syndrome, but it will actually be something that is based on the biology of the disease. And this is really scary because this means that a 55-year-old can go along and have a PET scan or have a blood test and be told you have Alzheimer's disease. But the reason why it will be important is because we do believe that these new drugs will be more effective if delivered earlier and earlier in the disease. The earlier they delivered, then the better the treatment efficacy will be. So there is a lot of controversy in the field at the moment. You'll see the American Alzheimer's Association definition is to be purely biology, whereas there's an international working group that is saying, no, we're not there yet. We still want to really look at someone's clinical presentations. And there certainly have been cases of people being diagnosed that get increasingly depressed or anxious or suicidal when they're diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And you can imagine the implications for insurance companies and all things like that when people, are diagnosed. How long will it really take for someone to progress if it's diagnosed very, very early from a PET scan? So are we well prepared? Just to wrap up, no, we're not. In Australia, we're much too slow at diagnosing Alzheimer's disease. So it takes about 3 to 4 years from when someone is presenting to actually get a diagnosis. Early we get in, the better. I think I've already said that, but data from memory clinics shows that we can keep people living in the community for longer and more independently if we offer early intervention techniques. There's many, many contributors to the untimely diagnosis. GPs don't have good tools. They're not very aware of the symptoms. They're obviously dealing with a lot of different things. But there's also been a bit of therapeutic nihilism. So what is the point in diagnosing dementia? Because there's nothing that we can do about it. We have them major bottlenecks in primary care, and we really need to think about those. And we have been lobbying the government for changes to Medicare, because this is actually one of the biggest barriers that, dementia diagnoses in primary care take time. We can't send everyone to a specialist clinic. Some of these diagnoses have to happen in primary care. There are also big opportunities in primary care because GPs see a lot of patients. They see older patients. They see people from midlife. Most people attending GPs have one of these, modifiable risk factors that we talked about. And they have critical population reach with long-standing patient relationships. And many people attending primary care will have cognitive concerns, so up to a quarter of those. And even more will have mild cognitive impairment. So this is really a great setting to be able to detect mild cognitive impairment in early stages. In New South Wales, we currently have memory clinics that service only 5% of the population that may have MCI or dementia. So this is woeful. Many of the Australian memory clinics operate at only 1 day and half a day a week. In the UK, their memory clinics operate 5 days a week, and our colleagues from China are here, and I heard the other day an astounding figure that they see 20,000 people a year in a memory clinic, which is one of the best memory clinics in Shanghai, I must say, or indeed in China. But in Australia, we see on average 200 people, so 3 to 5 people a week, and in some areas maybe 1 or 2 a month. So we really need governments to invest more in actually increasing capacity and increasing the number of memory clinics that we have. We also need to extend these into rural areas. So we're doing a study at the moment looking at a virtual memory clinic in Echuca, Victoria. And basically, the patients are awaiting 9 months to a year just to get seen, in their community, and presenting very, very late in the disease when there's not much that we can do about it. So we have a high proportion of older people in these regional areas, but very, very low specialist services. The wait lists are very long, and we don't have any opportunity for secondary intervention. The CALD communities are another ones where we have a barrier. So about a third of dementia cases are from people in CALD communities. Obviously, we need to think about different strategies, reducing stigma. How do we connect with these people from the culturally and linguistically diverse communities? How do we cater things, individually to those communities? It takes a long time to do this work, but it's really important with the Australian demographics changing that we think about this. Dementia research is woeful. So 2% of NHMRC funding went to dementia research. We had a bit of a peak in 2017, but we need much more in order to make a difference. And we really need to change this, not only in the basic science, but also the applied science. And we need to assist people to live well at home for longer. There's big impact on hospitals for people having hospital admissions, massive pressure on the aged care system. My mum is waiting 9 months just to get an ACAT assessment, and then it's another 12 months after that for a home care package. And yet there are people in her region, which is 5,500 people in the Southern Highlands, waiting just for an assessment. And many of those people are older people who really need to go to a nursing home, and they have no one. So this is something where we need major reform from the government. And lastly, are our memory clinics ready for these new drugs that are coming? So the TGA declined lecanemab, but donanemab, the other drug, is currently in submission by the TGA, and we may get better news on that one. Some of the data is slightly stronger. And it's probably a good thing that it didn't get approved because we don't have the capacity at the moment to deliver it. So of all of the people that could be eligible, which is about 8% of people that attend our specialist memory clinics, we only have capacity to service around 5% of those with these new drugs. So assuming that they're approved and subsidised, we need substantive investment in health services. So just to wrap up, really I think the take-home messages are that dementia will become more common because of the ageing population. We really need to be thinking about this. We need to be thinking about how to keep people living in the community for longer. We need to be thinking about what we can do from midlife to push back dementia by targeting those risk factors much better. I think the Heart Foundation have done a wonderful job at raising awareness around heart disease, and we kind of know what we need to do there. But there are many of these other things, particularly around mental health, etc., that we need to think about as well. And we really need to invest in our system. So wherever you can, if you know people people that have roles to play in the Ministry of Health, etc., then, you know, this is something we're really advocating for. And we know the National Dementia Action Plan will be released next year. The draft came out earlier this year, which many of us commented on, and we know that the government are trying to work with states and territories closely on putting some money behind the National Dementia Action Plan, including in these kind of health service areas as well. If you know anyone that has concerns about their memory or you have any concerns yourself, then we actually have a clinic at the University of Sydney that targets people from age 50. This is a research clinic, but we do actually give clinical reports, and everyone is seen by a geriatrician, a neuropsychologist, low wait times, people have an MRI scan, sleep study, etc., a whole range of different things. So there's a QR code there if you're interested. If you don't happen to live in this area or want to go to a more general service, then we have done a lot of work in the Australian Dementia Network to map the memory clinics around Australia. So you can go onto the Australian Dementia Network, you can type in or put your postcode in, it will show you what's available in your area, if there are any costs, if there are any interpreters and what kind of services are offered. And our clinics at the University of Sydney and RPA Hospital are listed on there as well. Dementia Australia is a really great resource, and for anyone kind of working in the area, the Wicking at University of Tasmania have done some great educational work. And Lee Fei Low, my colleague, and Henry Brodati have a wonderful website called Forward with Dementia, so I'd encourage you to have a look on that as well. And I'd just like to thank my team at the Healthy Brain Ageing team, mostly in the Faculty of Science, which our Dean is here today, so we have to give a plug for the wonderful School of Psychology in the Faculty of Science at the University of Sydney for supporting this work. And also I'd like to thank the Australian Dementia Network. So we're coming together nationally to try to advocate for reform in this field.
Great, thank you, Sharon. That was a wonderfully interesting talk, actually. I think, it's very relevant, I think, to all of us, and it's interesting to know what goes on. We're going to open for questions in a minute. One of the things that always interests me, though, is what's the underpinning biology as to why things like Alzheimer occur? Are we making any progress in that at all?
Yeah, we've made a lot of progress, particularly in amyloid, which is why those drugs are effective. We still need to make a lot more progress in tau. So, tau underpins some of the other pathologies and also the alpha-synuclein pathology. So we do need more, basic science understanding of how these diseases work. What actually leads to those changes in amyloid in the first place is still, something where there's wild debate in the field. And we do have a leader in Australia, Colin Masters, in the amyloids, so he's a fierce advocate of amyloid being the cause of everything. But we think that there are other things that we need to consider, very subtle changes in the cells, in the mitochondria, as we were talking about, and also in inflammation and oxidative stress and cardiovascular health that probably lead to some of those changes in the first place. We don't have a good handle on that just yet.
We have time for some questions, so a couple there. Have you got someone already? Go for it. But then can you...
Good morning. Why is it called type 3 diabetes?
Yeah, so diabetes is indeed, linked to Alzheimer's disease. And that's one thing I didn't talk about in detail, but actually diabetes, there are some drugs that have shown promise that are diabetes medications. So there is this link between type 2 diabetes and type 3 diabetes, being essentially the same notion that these changes in blood sugar are really pivotal for the functioning of the cell and the neurons. One of the other really promising things in the field is not only drugs like metformin, but the GLP-1 agonists. So everyone's heard about Ozempic for weight loss, etc. We think they play a really key role. So it's not a conclusive kind of thing yet, type 3 diabetes, but we do know the link between diabetes and dementia is pretty strong. We just don't really know when we should intervene and exactly what's the best thing to impact that.
We've got one here and then here.
Thank you for your informative presentation. You had an earlier slide which showed the proportion of women suffering dementia compared to males, and for all the age groups except one, women outranked men in terms of the proportion having dementia. Do they have any knowledge as to the reason for that consistent pattern?
There. Okay. Sorry. It's a good question. We don't know. It could be partly due to cohort effects, men living longer, etc. But there's also some data now on changes even in estrogen, and what are the effects of changes on estrogen on the accumulation of amyloid in the brain. And there's strong data on estrogen and progesterone, coming from a range of different sources as potentially being key to that increase in amyloid. And some data also suggesting that hormone replacement therapy may be helpful for that, but those trials are inconclusive at the moment, various methodological limitations as well.
Okay, thank you.
Over here.
Thank you. You mentioned that you're very mean with a clipboard asking questions to track cognitive impairment. Is there a computerised version of you where people can sit there and do that, baseline it and track it over
You'll be
time?
pleased to know there are computerised versions of me. But they're not well accepted yet. Clinically or in the literature. There are some that are certainly better than others, but the truth is that the diagnosis or classification of things like mild cognitive impairment requires very, very careful consideration of someone's education, occupation, and also comparison of performance to normative data. And so we want to know if we're comparing to someone of your own age, your own education, and that we're also using tests that we know will tap into that functioning of the hippocampus, and that we know tell us a lot about the brain. And the computerised tests just don't do that very well at the moment. And then there are problems about internet speeds and different things and how to best kind of assess that and ensure the integrity of the data. So it is coming, and it has to come, because we don't have enough people with clipboards, you'll be pleased to know. But we're not quite there yet. But certainly in some other countries, they're trying these kind of new digitised memory clinics and to include more computerised testing. And we're also testing some of that in Australia at the moment. But we absolutely have to move in that space.
Thank you, Sharon, for an informative talk. My wife went through the Mind and Brain Institute, and she was 10 years, and forever thankful for that, because it gave us the opportunity to track her as she went. Now, very early in my research project, they said to me, I asked them very directly, well, what is the prognosis? And I was told, 1 to 2 years, don't wait 12 months, there is urgency there. And I thought, over my dead body, I will look at what I can do, diet-wise, which we haven't mentioned here today. And I know it works. Vitamin D, zinc, magnesium, omega-3, turmeric, all those things that have an anti-inflammatory effect or a blood thinning effect or are just basically good for your immune system, because we got 10 years. And I know it works because I took it as well, and my brain became very much sharper. So why aren't we looking in these research projects at what we take for food? Pre-diabetics, cut down your sugars, cut down your carbs. There's got to be a link to it, and anything that will extend the time out must be beneficial.
It's
Can you
a good
comment
point.
on that, please?
No. And there is a link between diet and dementia. The trials that have been done showing that you change diet at a certain time, they're very difficult to do, but they've been inconclusive. So even this year at the Alzheimer's Association, there was a trial of a Mediterranean diet or a MIND diet, and the results weren't huge. Now, that's not to say they don't work. It's just very complex for us to prove conclusively and to get a high quality of evidence. We are doing that work in Australia. My colleague at the Charles Perkins, Luigi Fontana, has done some great work on caloric restriction and looking at the effects on metabolism and cell health. Also, my colleague Ralph Martins at Macquarie, we're doing a study called AU Arrow, which is a multi-domain intervention for people, including diet as a major feature. So we do believe there's something there. It's just really hard for us to show it because of the complexities of diet. And also those different combinations and things of which one should you take is kind of tricky to do as well. But yeah, it's a really good point.
Thank you again, Sharon.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. A glass of wine tonight for me. Thanks so much for that.
Actually, now you mention it, I think these are both sort of anti-dementia things, right?
Yes.
Alcohol and reading.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'll remember that as the sales point. Just to remind you that the final seminar for the year is on Wednesday, the 4th of December. And the speaker will be Dr. Daniel Getz, who's CEO of Myeloid Therapeutics. And just to remind you, that's also the company that's running the new RNA manufacturing facility that the New South Wales government is building at Macquarie. And his work is basically in the use of RNA for cancer therapeutics. So it's a really cutting edge area, and we hope to see you all again then. Thanks very much for coming.